Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. Conjurers, Georgia 4:30 p.m. January 13, 2010. A police officer was doing his usual rounds in his patrol car when a 16-year-old girl, Tasmia Whitehead, came running over to the car in floods of tears. Panicked and unable to breathe, she said that she and her twin sister, Jasmia, had found their mother brutally attacked in her boyfriend's home. Items in the house were on the floor and broken, and the floor and walls were covered in blood. 34-year-old Nikki Whitehead was in the bathtub and clearly deceased. It was a harrowing sight, and her twin daughters were beside themselves. Police quickly identified a potential murder weapon. A cracked vase lay on the living room floor. Following the trail of blood, it was evident that Nikki had tried to escape from the house out the back door, but the door was locked and Nikki continued to be attacked. She had been stabbed 80 times and her spinal cord was almost severed. She eventually succumbed to her injuries and had been dragged into the bathroom and placed into the tub. It was clear whoever did this had made some attempt to clean up the evidence, but the amount of blood was overwhelming and it would have been impossible to clean the crime scene. In the linen closet next to the bathroom, a stack of towels were missing. It didn't appear as if anything had been stolen, and there were no signs of a forced entry, so whoever had committed this crime must have had a personal relationship with Nikki. Lieutenant Chris Moon said it was the bloodiest crime scene he had ever been to. The police initially wanted to talk to just one person, Robert Head, who was Nikki's long-term boyfriend. Was it a crime of passion or a violent argument that had spiraled dangerously out of control? However, Nikki's twin girls, Jasmia and Tasmia, said this wasn't possible as Robert had left on a trucking job the day before they did, however, point the police in another direction. Nikki had another boyfriend called Joe, and the girls said they had heard their mother arguing with him on the phone into the early hours of the morning. The investigating officers tracked Joe down and questioned him. He appeared genuinely devastated that Nikki was dead and had no idea who would want to hurt her. When asked about the argument the night before, he admitted that it had happened but said that Nikki was the aggressor. Satisfied with his version of events, the team were back at square one around 10:00 a.m. January 14. The police needed more information about the days and weeks leading up to the murder, and the only two people who would likely know this were Jasmia and Tasmia. They took the girls to the Conjurers Police Department for a victim's interview, and the girls were still visibly distressed and extremely shaken. While in the patrol car, Tasmia started biting her arm. She explained she had a nervous habit and it was something she did when she was stressed. A short while later, the interview began. Tajma's mother, Tajma's sister and Tajma's brother, Tajma's brother and Tajma's mother, Tajma's sister and Tajma's brother, 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 Tasmia's sister and Tajma's brother, Tajma's sister and Tajma's brother, Tajma's sister and Tajma's brother, Tasmia's sister and Tajma's brother, Tajma's sister and Tajma's brother, Tasmia's sister and Tajma's brother, Tajma's sister and Ta. The team didn't draw any attention to the scratches and bite marks on the twins, keeping their thoughts close to their chests, but it was very clear that the story the girls were telling wasn't the full version of the truth. One of the officers, Detective Swift, asked the girls if he could do anything for them, to which the twins responded oddly, asking if they could watch an episode of CSI. The officers felt at this point that they were looking at their main suspects. Although the girls admitted to having a tough relationship with their mother, this Wasn't enough to establish any kind of motive. The team were also waiting on DNA evidence to come back from the house, so all they could do was let the girls go back into the custody of their great-grandmother. Della officers began talking to Nikki's friends about Jasmia and Tasmia, and the friends painted their occasional fights in a very different light. The officers quickly realized that the twins had very much downplayed how severe and volatile these fights could be, and a dysfunctional and disturbing picture began to emerge. Tasmia and Jasmia Whitehead had both been straight A students, high achievers and well-behaved young girls. They were talented in many things including dance, music and sports, and they seemed to be on track for a great future with dreams of going to the prestigious Harvard University. The twins' home lives, however, were a lot more difficult. Their mother Nikki had been born in prison while her mother was doing time for drug possession and had left home at 16 years old after years of a tumultuous relationship. She was living on the streets when she fell pregnant. The twins' father rejected Nikki and wanted nothing to do with the babies. Nikki gave birth when she was 18 and moved in with her grandmother Della Frazier. The relationship between her and the twins was strained from the beginning, with her grandmother Della essentially raising them. Although Nikki was trying to better herself and be a working mother, Della said that Nikki just wasn't consistent in her children's lives and would come and go too often, partying and drinking. As Jasmia and Tasmia got older, they began to find their mother's attempts to discipline them hypocritical. However, in 2007 Nikki met 55-year-old Robert Head. They quickly hit it off and he took on the role of provider for her and the twins. He had them move in with him shortly after. He lived in Bridal Ridge Walk, a safe gated complex in a well-off area with little crime. This was a fresh start for Nikki and the girls, and it offered them a sense of stability. Robert was a long-distance truck driver and spent a lot of time away from home, leaving Nikki to look after the girls alone. This was something that friends and family said that Nikki struggled with, having never really done it alone before. The twins pushed back and fought against Nikki's discipline. 119-9-1-1 call was made when Nikki realized 13-year-old Jasmia had snuck out of the house to meet her boyfriend. It was clear that Nikki was losing control. When Nikki asked for full custody of her 13-year-old girls, it was obvious that she and her daughters had a troubled and hostile relationship, often resulting in physical fights. The trio were in and out of counseling, and the girls would frequently appear in juvenile court. One fight in particular got really out of control. One evening, Nikki phoned a friend in a panic. She said that she had locked herself in the bathroom because the girls were trying to attack her. When the police arrived, Nikki showed the officer scratch marks and blood. Jasmia also had scratches on her body and claimed that her mother had started the fight. Shortly after this incident in 2008, Della took back custody of Jasmia and Jasmia on January 5, 2010. The now 16-year-old twins went back to live with Nikki. The girls protested, saying they didn't want to live with her, but the court ruled they needed to go on a trial period, and tragically just 8 days later Nikki would be found dead. For months would pass after Nikki's murder, and with everything seemingly going quiet, the twins were back at school, keeping up their grades as well as keeping a low profile. But in May of 2010 the evidence from the crime scene was finally back and analyzed, and it confirmed what the police had already suspected. The bite marks on the twins' bodies matched a plaster cast that had been made of Nikki's teeth when Jasmia had been biting her own arm to pass it off as a stress-induced habit. It was actually her deliberately trying to leave new teeth marks over Nikki's. The vase that had been used to hit Nikki over the head was covered in the twins' blood. A pair of boots were also found, covered in a mixture of blood. They had been placed neatly in a shoebox and hidden in the closet. The stack of towels missing from the linen closet were also found, and they too were covered in blood in the washing machine. These were things that a random intruder wouldn't likely do. With all this evidence finally coming together on May 21, the last day of School. The police placed Tasmia and Jasmia under arrest for the murder of their mother. They had gone from being victims themselves to teenage killers. As soon as they were placed in the officer's car, they were heard shouting and swearing, maintaining that they had done nothing wrong. Questions from the defense team arose, arguing that the girls were either identical twins, so determining whose DNA was whose was impossible. However, the prosecution argued that this was a non-issue, as it was evident that both the girls had worked together to carry out the attack. They believed that Nikki had woken the girls up for school sometime around 7 a.m. and the attack took place shortly after they were caught walking past a gas station together, and then were picked up around 10:00 a.m. on the school CCTV, arriving late to their classes, but both arrived at the same time, further cementing the prosecution's theory of them working together. This, alongside the evidence from the crime scene and the witnesses that could attest to the fighting, was enough for a grand jury to side with the prosecution. On July 12, both girls were indicted for murder and plead not guilty in 2012. While still awaiting trial, the attorneys for the girls put forward a request for a plea bargain. They argued that Nikki was also to blame in the situation. They said that her history of drinking and drug use played a part, coupled with her staying out late and often ignoring her children. They said that the girls simply couldn't take it anymore, and things had come to a head. On January 13, 2010, it was on these grounds that they asked for the charges of murder to be dropped and voluntary manslaughter to take its place. The prosecution and the officers said they wanted to hear the confession from the girls themselves. Before they considered this, they met with the girls separately and they began to tell a shocking story. Jasmia and Tasmia said that Nikki had come home drunk the night before the incident took place. She began hurling abuse at them, which carried on into the morning. When the girls came down for breakfast, things started to unravel. My mom was just winning that battle with the knife or whatever, so I picked up the pot and I hit her with the pot. She bit me in the chest. Like I said, I'm not that big, so when she bit me she latched onto me and I'm trying to get her off of me because it hurts. I'm trying to punch her, I guess, and I think Dad stabbed her. He stabbed her. What did y'all do? We put her in the truck. What's she saying? She gave up. It's the same thing, going to jail. Going to jail. What are you saying to her? I'm sorry. I told her I was sorry when that was it. Let me use your words. When that was it. What did you and your sister do? I don't know. I guess we were shocked. I mean, we didn't really believe what we did. We started laying in the pile and we just wanted to cover it up. I guess. I'm sorry I'm missing, but it was not what Linda and all of them tried to make it seem. I didn't hate her. I just was built up. I don't know. I guess even more than just built up anger towards all three of us. I really wish it didn't happen like that. I wish I could have saw something else to do. I wish I did. Sorry. On January 9, 2014, almost exactly 4 years since Nikki had been killed, Tasmia appeared in Rockdale County Court to enter a plea of guilty to voluntary manslaughter. 1 month later, Tasmia followed suit. They were both sentenced to 30 years for the crime, and their attorney said that the sentence allowed the girls some sort of future. The state's recommendation as to count 1 is 20 years to serve in prison. As to count 2, the state's recommendation is 5 years to serve in prison to run consecutive to count 1. As to count 3, the state's recommendation is 5 years to run consecutive to counts 1 and count 2, for a total of 30 years in prison. That is the maximum the court can award for consent to under these charges. Years ago, the twins Jasmia and Tasmia were in ballet and getting academic honors. I always saw them at Harvard or Yale, and never would I have ever imagined that they would be sitting in a jail cell for killing their mother. But their grandmother says the girls started to get into trouble when they were 14, even attacking and injuring their mom in a fight over cell phone privileges. The girls were also temporarily placed with their great-grandmother, but a juvenile court decided to send them back to their mother's house. They were placed back into the home, and 6 days later my Daughters found dead. Jasmia graduated high school in prison and served as class valedictorian. Her great grandmother Della Frazier was there to watch her graduate. I am so proud of her. I feel so good about what she accomplished, and I always wanted to see this day come that she graduated and moved on to things that she wants to do in life, because she is a very gifted girl. Nikki Whitehead was met with a terrible end at the hands of her daughters, and no one will ever truly know what happened inside that house on January 13, 2010, but the events that took place were undoubtedly avoidable and horrifying. They shocked even the most tenor of officers. The girls were incarcerated at separate prisons within the Georgia Department of Corrections. Jasmia is serving her sentence in Pulaski State Prison and Jasmia at Arundel State Prison. They were eligible for parole in 2017, which they did not receive. If they do not receive parole at any point, they will be scheduled for release in 2040. They will be 47 years old. Story 2. Phoenix is a beautiful person, not only to look at as you can see, but also to know. Phoenix is a very compassionate young lady. She has a very keen sense of fairness. She has a great sense of humor. Phoenix she's everything to us. She is my only child and I love her dearly, and I miss her and I want to see her. I need to see Phoenix. We need to see Phoenix. We need to know. We need to know what has happened to Phoenix. Phoenix Lucille Colden was born Phoenix Reeves on May 23, 1988 to parents Goldia and Lawrence. Her father Lawrence adopted her soon after she was born, and her name was changed to Colon. She was born in California, but the family moved to an area of Spanish for Lawrence's job. She was an only child. Inquisitive, bright and creative, Phoenix showed incredible talent and promise from a young age. The Coldens were a deeply spiritual and religious family, and Phoenix would attend church regularly, and she was also in the choir. Friends of Phoenix said she led a very disciplined life, and that her parents, although were loving and supportive, were also very strict with high expectations. Friends claimed that Phoenix had expressed a desire to break away from her sheltered life and experience everything that came with school and college. She had been mostly homeschooled. From the 6th grade she worked hard at all her studies and was a very high achiever. Her main passion, however, appeared to be music, where she excelled playing violin and piano. She was also a regional junior fencing champion in 2007. She enrolled at the University of Missouri, and by this point had already moved out of the family home and into an apartment. Her parents signed the lease believing she was moving in with a friend. Her parents also said that it was around this time that Phoenix started acting differently and began arguing with them frequently. However, this was a big change for Phoenix. She had gone from a relatively sheltered upbringing to a completely new and open world at university, which may have caused some tensions between her and her parents. What her parents didn't realize, however, was that Phoenix was in a relationship with someone named Michael B., and she was actually living in the apartment with him. Her mother said that although she visited the apartment regularly, there was nothing to indicate she had a secret live-in boyfriend. Her friends speculated she may have felt this was the only way she could see Michael B., and she had to keep it a total secret. When Goldia found out about the relationship, she said that Michael B. was not someone she would have approved of her daughter dating. Phoenix began to miss her college classes, which culminated in her failing to register for her 4th semester, another fact her parents and friends would not find out about for a long time. During the early months of 2011, it is said that Phoenix began taking money from the family safe. The money was in saving bonds, and although it was Phoenix's money, it was in her mother's name. A total of around $2,500 was taken, and where the money ended up remains a mystery. In May of 2011, she moved back into the family home. Her mother said this was purely down to finances. Phoenix was able to study at university and stay at home, and this was far more cost-effective than her parents paying out for an apartment. Little did Goldia no, but Phoenix was not attending university at this time when she returned from college. Everyone who knew Phoenix described her as a totally different person. Her friends said that she had started experimenting with drugs, arguing with her parents more and pushing people away. Her best friend and neighbor Akira commented that she wasn't the friend she once knew. She said she seemed paranoid, irritable and erratic, and she was convinced that she was being followed. During a brief and trivial argument with Akira, Phoenix pulled a knife and brandished it at her. She kept this 10-in blade down the side of her car door with no explanation as to why. Although the pair would move past the fight, Akira could tell that something was very wrong and no one could seemingly get to the bottom of it. Phoenix would often sit in her car for long periods of time, spending hours on her phone, and her mother began to wonder why she needed even more privacy than that of her own room in her own house. It was later discovered that Phoenix had two phones. One was on a family plan and one she was seemingly paying for herself. It seemed that Phoenix's life was far more complex and complicated than anyone had realized. December 18, 2011 would start as any other day in the Golden household. Phoenix and her mom attended the Sunday church service at 11:00 a.m., where Phoenix played in the bell choir. Fellow churchgoers and her pastor said nothing seemed off or amiss with Phoenix that day. Phoenix and her mom traveled back in Phoenix's car, briefly stopping at a convenience store on the way. During the car journey, Phoenix said to her mother that she wanted things to get back to how they had used to be. Goldia seemed hopeful that this would be a step forward in their relationship. They returned to the house at around 2:00 p.m. Phoenix changed into some sweatpants and a hoodie and went outside to play basketball. Just after 3 p.m., Phoenix grabbed her phone past her father, who had just returned from work, without engaging in conversation, and got into her 1998 Chevy Blazer and pulled away from the house, assuming she was going shopping or visiting friends. Lawrence didn't think anything of this, but sadly this would be the last time he would ever see his daughter, and that is where the 18th of December takes a sinister turn. Phoenix always stuck to her parents' curfew of 1:00 a.m. and had never stayed away from the house all night, and when she still wasn't home the following morning, Goldia knew in her gut that something serious had happened to her child. When she phoned the St. Louis County Police Department to report her daughter as missing, she was met with a lot of pushback. The officer who took the call told Goldia that Phoenix was a 23-year-old woman and was old enough to make her own decisions about where she went, but Goldia knew despite this was simply not in her daughter's nature, and her age was irrelevant. The officer ran Phoenix's car number plate through the system and said it hadn't turned up anything. Goldia and Lawrence were now frantic with worry, so decided to take matters into their own hands. They phoned around the hospitals to see if anyone fitting her description had been admitted and began circulating flyers. They contacted various television networks begging for her case to be circulated, but the networks failed to pick up the case. No one was following up on the case or reporting on it, and the Colden family felt ignored and let down. Valuable time was being lost, and Phoenix's family were working incredibly hard to keep the case in people's minds, trying to make up for the lack of coverage and interest in it. About 2 weeks later, her parents finally located her car. It was sitting impounded in a tow yard, having been there since the day she disappeared. The car was discovered just a 25-minute drive away from her home at 5:30 p.m. This was around 3 hours after Phoenix had left her house. The car had been impounded less than an hour after it was found. Goldia and Lawrence Colden, the parents of missing Phoenix. Colden, you called police and you told them my daughter is gone and this is the car she was last seen in. What's your reaction to the fact that cops impounded that car very quickly but didn't make the connection that the car they were looking for was in their impound lot for I don't know how long days? We reported our daughter missing the following day, which would be the 19th. We didn't find that car for 2 weeks. It was in the Impound lot, and only through the diligence of a close friend did we find that car in 2018. The network Oxygen looked into Phoenix Sen's case. Investigative reporter Chandria Thomas and retired police chief Joseph Dia headed the investigation and began uncovering more information. Chandria Thomas was actually a huge reason that Phoenix's case was brought to the media's attention, and she fought hard to keep it there too. Joe and Chandri looked into the state that Phoenix's car was found in. There have been many conflicting stories surrounding the car. Since the start of the search for Phoenix, it was originally reported to have been found on the side of the road. The engine was still running, the keys were in the ignition, and the driver's side door was open. Phoenix's shoes and purse were also in the car. Chandria and Joe met with Officer Perry, who initially found the car and told them that the doors were closed, no key was in the ignition, and apart from a few random miscellaneous items, there had been nothing of interest inside the vehicle. He said it looked like the car had simply been pulled over and parked, almost as if someone had run out of fuel. When Officer Perry ran the license plate through the system, it did not flag up as stolen or suspicious, and thus it was towed off. The reason this may not have flagged up was that the car was now in a different area that had a separate police department, meaning any connections to the missing Phoenix in Spanish Lake would likely not have been made at the time the car was found. Phoenix was not yet listed as a missing person either. One thing that was determined about the car was that the only DNA found inside belonged to Phoenix and her parents. The location of her car rang alarm bells with Goldia. It was in a derelict, rundown and dangerous area of East St. Louis known for crime and drugs, and her mother said she would have had no business being in that part of town had the car been stolen, driven there and dumped. Had she driven it there herself and left it, or had she been snatched from inside the car? More evidence was garnered from the 2018 review of the case regarding her phone records. On December 17, just a day before she was last seen, she made a total of 10 phone calls to her secret boyfriend Michael B. using the phone on her family plan. That final call was 116 minutes long. On December 18, 2011, phone records again showed that the last person she spoke to using the phone on her family plan was again Michael B. This call was made at 1:46 p.m. and lasted just 1 minute. It appeared from looking at the phone records that this was the last call Phoenix ever made from that phone, although officers said they were keeping any further information about the phone records and coordinates of the phone close to their chest while the case is still being investigated. Although people initially reported that Phoenix's boyfriend Michael B. had been evasive, the investigating officers reported he was actually very cooperative, and they were confident that he was in no way involved in Phoenix's disappearance. A theory that was presented early on, one that remains a theory to this day, was that she had potentially been taken by a human trafficking gang. The St. Louis area remains one of the top areas in the country for human trafficking, and this fact couldn't be overlooked. The highway close to where her car had been found, Interstate 70, is referred to as the trafficking highway. This theory was further fueled when a picture of her allegedly began circulating on a sex website, but it is believed that this was most likely nothing more than a nasty hoax. Another common thought was that the pressure in Phoenix's life had resulted in her wanting to start afresh and leave everything behind. Her best friend Akira said that Phoenix had told her she had wanted to pack her things and leave, but to where Phoenix never said. The theory that she may have ran away has always been disputed by her family. Akira would also claim that Phoenix was secretly seeing another man alongside Michael B. His name was also Mike, and he was referred to as Cell Phone Mike. Akira believed this new relationship was most likely the reason for the second phone. One of Cell Phone Mike's ex-girlfriends was interviewed, and she said that Mike had been violent with her during their relationship, resulting in her filing a restraining order against him. She alleged that Mike had taken an interest in Phoenix's case and would often look it up online. When she asked him about Phoenix, he replied it remains unknown. If he had any involvement in Phoenix's disappearance or if he was just making a speculative, albeit crass, comment. In a now infamous and haunting video, Phoenix films herself as she sits in the car. The full video has never been released, but Chandri Thomas and Joe Delia looked into it closely during their investigation. They took the video to an audio engineer to get a full and clear understanding of what it was. Phoenix had said she asks God to help her accept the things she cannot change, and says she goes on to say the video was recorded just 1 month before she disappeared in March 2014. A reported sighting of Phoenix came in. One of Phoenix's friends from church was getting ready to fly back from Vegas, and all the passengers were boarding the plane. As she sat down, she says Phoenix walked past her in the aisle with a group of women and 2 older men. Her friend said she called out her name when the lady turned around and looked at her. She said her friend noted that the women all looked similar to Phoenix and the men appeared to be around 10 years older than the women. When she got off the plane, she ran straight to the service desk and reported that she had seen the missing person. Although the police quickly began searching the area, no trace of the woman in question was ever found. Her friend said on a scale of 1 to 10 of how confident she was that it was Phoenix, and she was a definite 9. Many tips came in that would lead the family and police nowhere. Everything from fake phone calls with people pretending to be the missing Phoenix to tip-offs claiming that Phoenix was involved in a cult and couldn't escape. But one tip in particular would cost the Coldens dearly. A man provided seemingly credible information about Phoenix's whereabouts, and Goldie and Lawrence spent their remaining savings on a private investigator to follow up on this lead. The lead turned out to be nothing more than a cruel hoax. Goldie and Lawrence had reached their financial limits and were forced to make a quick sale on their home. They had to move out of the area and the family home that they had loved so much during the 2018 look into Phoenix's case. Chandria Thomas and Joe Delia found that Phoenix had 2 birth certificates, one under Phoenix Sen and one under Phoenix Reeves. A private investigator looked into the certificate under the name of Reeves and found that there was actually a Phoenix Reeves. This Phoenix Reeves had no social security number and no associated birth date. The only thing that linked with that name was an address that was listed as being occupied between the dates of January 2012 and June 2012. Before January 2012, this Phoenix Reeves did not exist, and this person would cease to exist after June of that year. The person living in the house at the time of the 2018 investigation said she had been the sole occupier of that house since 2002, and no one by the name of Phoenix had ever lived there. Although eerie and a most definitely interesting lead, it appeared that this was nothing more than a strange coincidence. One thing that is for certain is that since Phoenix disappeared, no money has been taken from her bank accounts, no forms of identification have been renewed, and her digital footprint is non-existent. Everything seemed to stop on December 18, 2011. Therefore, the possibility of this case ultimately being a homicide has never been ruled out. What happened to 23-year-old Phoenix Sen on December 18, 2011 remains a total mystery, and no trace of her has ever been found. Was she abducted on December 18? Did she leave of her own accord to start a new life? It is still an ongoing case, and her family and friends continuously pray and hope for answers. Her parents believe that she is still alive and being held somewhere. Against her will, they have never given up hope that she will one day come home. If you have any information relating to the disappearance or whereabouts of Phoenix Colden, please contact the Spanish Lake Police Department. Story 3 stars and millions around the world are in shock over the execution-style murder of designer Gianni Versace, shot to death at point-blank range on the steps of his Miami Beach villa. Hundreds of leads are in fact being traced as we speak. Thousands of flyers have been distributed throughout this community in the nation on the internet, on television, in newspapers across the globe. Andrew Cunanan is in fact a marked man. Giovanni Maria Versace was born on December 2, 1946 in Italy. He grew up with his brother Santo's sister Donatella and his parents Francesca and Antonio. He and his siblings were particularly close, made even more so when they tragically lost their older sister Tina. Johnny adored his mother. She was a talented dressmaker and he became immersed in her creative world from a young age. He made his first dress aged just 9 years old, a striking blue one-shoulder gown. He didn't know it at the time, but this very dress would be worn by Diana, the Princess of Wales. 40 years later he worked as an apprentice in his mother's sewing business and threw himself into the world of design, color and art, heavily influenced by Greek history and mythology as well as artists like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein. His ideas about fashion were unique and filled with bold prints and exciting statements. Aged 26 he moved to one of the fashion capitals of the world, Milan, to work in design and immerse himself in fashion. He became the designer for several well-established fashion houses. People loved his work and creative flair, and he was encouraged to work on his own collections for women. He presented these at the Palazzo della Permanente Art Museum and put together his first fashion show just months later in 1978. He opened up his first boutique at the age of 32 and the sky was the limit for him. After this he began building the empire that would ultimately become the internationally recognized Versace fashion brand. His brother Santo became president of the company with his younger sister Donatella acting as vice president. The famous Versace logo depicting Medusa's head came from the floors of some of the ruins that Johnny and his siblings used to play in his children. It was an ambitious, family-run fashion business with Johnny firmly at the helm and having full creative control of the company. By 1982 Versace was working on more than clothes, jewelry, handbags and purses and homeware textiles. The brand was now rapidly expanding. It was in this year he met model Antonio Demo. The spark was instant and they started a relationship which would last 15 years. Johnny understood the power of celebrity and loved to use famous faces as walking adverts for his designs. He was friends with people such as Diana, Princess of Wales, Eric Clapton, Madonna and Michael Hutchins, to name a few. He is credited as having discovered models like Naomi Campbell and Linda Evangelista, consistently working with them on ad campaigns as well as on the runway. He adored theater and spent a lot of his career making costumes for various performers and shows, working with everything from operas and ballets to clothing for music videos. Johnny embraced all aspects of fashion and never limited himself to any one area. He designed clothing for Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney's 1983 hit song Say Say and worked with Elton John to create the costumes for his 1992 world tour. He was recognized as being someone that brought together the worlds of fashion and music in a whole new way. October 21, 1990 Johnny was working in San Francisco having designed some costumes for the opera when he bumped into a man named Andrew Cunanan whom Johnny seemed to recognize from somewhere. The exact events of this meeting remain unclear, but witnesses claimed there was a definite encounter between the pair. His sister Donatella disputes this and denies they ever met. What was for certain is that Cunanan developed a dangerous obsession with the fashion designer, one which would ultimately lead to the death of Gianni Versace in 1993. Versace was diagnosed with a rare form of ear cancer. While he battled the cancer successfully, it had taken a physical toll and he started to delegate some of the business responsibilities. Despite this, in the mid-90s he was still at the top of his career. Iconic Versace designs such as Elizabeth Hull's safety pin dress, Princess Diana's purple gala gown and Naomi Campbell's Andy Warhol pop art statement piece put the Versace brand at the top of the fashion industry. Johnny purchased the villa for just under $3 million and a year later he bought the adjoining hotel to extend the sprawling property. 6 a.m. A hot summer's day on July 15, 1997. Always the early riser, Johnny woke up to begin his day. He made several business calls to Milan, then set off on a morning walk around Miami Beach, usually surrounded by a large entourage. On this particular day he walked alone. He made a stop to buy some papers and a copy of Vogue and grabbed a takeout coffee around 8:45 a.m. He was back home and was looking for his house keys in his pocket when a dark-haired man in shorts and a baseball cap came rushing up to him. A single shot was fired and Johnny Versace fell on the steps of his home. A second shot was fired at him as he lay on the floor, and the shooter quickly ran away from the scene, being chased by one of Johnny's neighbors. But the shooter was fast and he sped off into the busy morning rush of Miami Beach. The ambulance quickly arrived and he was rushed to the Jackson Memorial Hospital, but tragically just after 9:20 a.m. Johnny Versace was pronounced dead. A manhunt was now on for the shooter, and it didn't take long for the police to identify him. It was Andrew Cunanan, a man the FBI had actually been searching for months already. Cunanan was a serial killer who adopted different looks and names to carry out a string of brutal murders across a 3-month period. He had moved to the Miami Beach area a couple of months before with his next victim in mind. Cunanan was noted as being a prolific and compulsive liar throughout his life, forever exaggerating events and fabricating stories. His childhood was undoubtedly troubled, and it is thought that he had undiagnosed personality disorders. In 1988, when Cunanan was 19, his stockbroker father abandoned the family and moved to the Philippines to avoid being arrested for embezzlement. That same year his mother, who was deeply religious, discovered Cunanan was gay, and this sparked a terrible argument in which he threw his mother against the wall, dislocating her shoulder. Cunanan was obsessed with living a lavish lifestyle and began dating wealthy older men to help fund his dreams. He was also dealing opioids and cocaine, as well as abusing painkillers, methamphetamine and alcohol. Himself, he never settled in any one place and often upped and left, creating a new identity. As he did so, he had huge financial troubles with large amounts of debt across multiple credit cards, and he used his relationships with wealthy men as a way of supporting himself and the upkeep of his fake lifestyle. His first victim was 28-year-old Jeffrey Trail, whom he murdered in Minneapolis in April of 1997. Trail and Cunanan briefly dated, and when an argument with Trail ensued, Cunanan stole his gun and took it to an apartment belonging to David Madsen. David Madsen was also an ex-lover, and Cunanan became jealous and paranoid over Madsen and Trail's friendship. Cunanan phoned Jeffrey Trail from Madsen's apartment, telling him he had his gun. When Trail arrived, Cunanan beat Trail to death with a hammer in front of David Madsen and then fled with Madsen across the state. Just 2 days later, co-workers found Trail's body rolled up in a rug behind the sofa. A duffel bag nearby gave police their first lead on May 2. Witnesses saw Madsen and Cunanan driving and eating lunch together just north of Minneapolis. David Madsen's body was discovered a day later near a lake in Rush City, Minnesota. He had been shot with the gun Cunanan had stolen from Jeffrey Trail. Although police initially suspected that David Madsen may have been involved with the murder of Jeffrey Trail, it became obvious that he was being held hostage by Cunanan. Just a day later, and after fleeing to Illinois, he found his third victim, 72-year-old real estate tycoon Lee Miglin. It remains unclear how they met, but police don't believe it was a random attack. Cunanan bound Miglin's hands and feet and wrapped his head with duct tape. He proceeded to stab him more than 20 times with a screwdriver, as well as slitting his throat with a hacksaw. He then stole his green Lexus LS sedan and took off. When police realized that Miglin's car had been stolen, they also found David Madsen's red Jeep parked on the same street. The Jeep had a car phone inside, and using evidence from the phone they began to piece together a timeline of Events and locations. Kinanan had also been picked up on CCTV with David Madsen. As they left the apartment building where Jeffrey Trail had died, and police knew that this was their only suspect in New Jersey. On May 9, Kinanan shot dead a cemetery caretaker, William Riekind. An loving family man who was dedicated to his job. Was killed completely at random. Police speculated that he was shot purely because Kinanan wanted to steal his red Chevrolet pickup truck. When police arrived on scene, they noted that the same gun had been used, and they knew instantly it was Kinanan. On May 12, he checked into the Normandy Plaza Hotel in Miami Beach, paying a month in advance in cash. Living in Miami until the middle of July, he remained undetected and unnoticed, with the police having no luck in locating him. Andrew Kinanan was added onto the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. He had killed 4 people in 12 days, and there seemed no end to his rampage. Posters of his many looks and names were printed and put up everywhere. Kinanan was so confident he wouldn't get caught, he pawned a gold chain he had stolen from one of his victims in a nearby shop. He filled out the form with his real name and current address, even showing his ID and leaving a thumbprint on the document as required by law. A copy of this document was given to the police, but for whatever reason, nobody picked up on this, and his name quite literally went to the bottom of the pile. On July 14, Kinanan left the hotel. He spent a night on the town visiting local bars and even telling someone on the dance floor that he was a serial killer, playing it off as a joke. Early morning July 15, he headed to Gianni Versace's residence armed with the same gun he had stolen, and waited for the fashion icon to emerge. He fled the hideout on a houseboat about 2 miles away from Johnny's house when the police discovered William Reese's truck in a parking garage near Versace's house. It was filled with Kinanan's clothes and newspaper articles of the murders he had committed. It was clear that he relished the notoriety. Police suspected he was in the houseboat for several days. Kinanan knew the police were closing in on him, and he was now the most wanted man in America. Over 1,000 agents were looking for him, and it was one of the biggest manhunts in history. On July 23, a caretaker stopped by to check up on the empty houseboat, not knowing this was the boat concealing the fugitive. When he found him inside, he ran and phoned the police immediately. He heard a gunshot from inside and reported to police that he had found Kinanan and a shot had been fired. A SWAT team responded within minutes and waited outside watching the boat for almost 2 hours. We have more of our continuing live coverage of the possible sighting of serial killer or suspected serial killer Andrew Kinanan in Miami, and let's go to the Satellite Center. Brendan Keith standing by with the very latest. Brendan, now we have more live pictures just into Eyewitness News. We're going to go to those pictures now. They show the scene here in the Miami Beach area. You're actually looking at the coastline right here, and they will have some close-up shots in just a moment of the houseboat that SWAT teams, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and the Florida Marine Patrol have surrounded that houseboat. It is believed has a robbery suspect inside holed up, and it is also reported that that robbery suspect fired on a caretaker there at this particular houseboat you're looking at right now. Once again, the police have this entire block cordoned off. There are Marine units from the Florida Marine Patrol, also ground units from the SWAT team, Miami Beach Police, Metro-Dade County Police also. They're all surrounding, waiting to see whether they're going to have to move in. It's unclear right now whether they're in a standoff situation or whether they're in contact with the man inside the house. The media were out in force as well, filming the events live as they unfolded. There was no reaction from Kinanan, so the SWAT team threw tear gas onto the boat and stormed it. They found Kinanan's body on the bed upstairs in the master bedroom. He had shot himself. He left no suicide notes and no explanation for anything he had done. Andrew Kinanan's rampage was a vicious and brutal one, and the residents of Miami breathed a sigh of relief when It was all over. Kananan left a trail of destruction behind him, and the police will never know the full extent of the events that took place over the previous months, possibly even dating back earlier. His father Modesto was eventually tracked down to his hideout in the Philippines, but had nothing to say. Around 2,000 people attended Johnny's memorial in Milan, and the amount of lives he had touched with his talents and warm personality was clear for all to see. Some of his stores dressed their mannequins in black to mourn his passing, and Versace's work was honored by a posthumous exhibit at the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. From his humble beginnings, Versace created a fashion empire. It is now one of the most recognized names in the world. Capri Holdings, formerly known as Michael Kors Holdings Limited, acquired the Versace brand in 2018 for just over $2 billion. Donatella and Sto Versace are still heavily involved in the company, with Donatella as artistic director and Santo as chairman and president. The CEO is now Jonathan Ackroyd. Johnny Versace was a gifted and creative visionary who changed the course of fashion and design. He argued against the fashion norms and carved out a new path for designers to follow for years to come. His work was undoubtedly iconic, and his place in history can never be overlooked, and he will surely never be forgotten. Story 4. Right, listen very carefully to what I've got to say to you now. You are under arrest for the murder of Lisey Susan Moley between 12 noon on Sunday, October 5, 1975 and 6:45 a.m. on Wednesday, October 8, 1975. October 8, 1975. The body of a little girl is found by the side of a remote road. She's lying in the grass, face down in the mud. She has been subjected to a horrifying sexual assault and has been stabbed a shocking 12 times, with one of the stab wounds piercing her heart. What had started as a missing child investigation had now become a major murder inquiry. Little do people know at the time is that it will lead to one of the most appalling miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. At around lunchtime on October 5, 1975, 11-year-old Leslie Moley was asked to go to the shop by her mother. The family used a rotor to ensure that all children did chores, and children in the area were often trusted to run small errands for their parents. They lived on Delamere Road in Rodale, Greater Manchester. 11-year-old Leslie lived with her mother April Daney, her stepfather, and her two sisters. Life for Lisey, often called well by her mother, hadn't always been easy. She had been born with a congenital cardiac condition and an operation to correct this at the age of 3 had left her frail with a reduced mental level for her age. She was told by her mother to go and buy some bread and air freshener from a nearby shop located on Ansell Road, and in her blue raincoat little Leslie set off. She was spotted walking on the secluded Steops Lane, then she vanished. When Leslie failed to return home quickly, April became concerned and sent her siblings out to see if they could find her, and Daney soon joined in the search too. The family looked everywhere they could think of, but Leslie couldn't be found, and there was no evidence that she had made it to the shops at 3 p.m. and with no trace of her anywhere, the family frantically contacted Rodale police. Investigators quickly mobilized and formed a search. They checked the town and local area, interviewing people and looking everywhere to try and find the vulnerable young girl. While the police were searching for Lisey, 4 girls aged 12, 13, 16 and 18 came forward to the police. They told officers that a man had exposed himself to them the day before Lisey had gone missing with a missing child, and these 4 girls now saying this. The police quickly pursued the lead. He was soon identified as 23-year-old Stefan Kishko. Stefan was a local tax clerk. His parents had immigrated to the UK from Eastern Europe following the end of the Second World War. Outside of his mother and aunt, he didn't have a social life. His father had suffered a heart attack 5 years before, and he had died at Stefan's feet. He also had learning difficulties, meaning he had the mental age of around 12 years old. Despite him never having been in trouble with the law, the police quickly determined that he was the man they were looking for with his poor social skills, his odd habits including writing down registration plates of cars that annoyed him, and with the testimony of the 4 girls saying he had exposed himself. The police were determined to prove that he was their man. Just 3 days after Leslie had vanished, the worst fears of everyone were realized. Her little body was found by the side of a road. She had been brutally attacked and stabbed to death in a horrifying frenzied attack. Her appalling death left the local community in shock. It made headlines around the country and left her family utterly devastated. On the 21st of December 1975, Stefan Kishko was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was intensely questioned, with his story being picked apart by the police. After 3 days he confessed. On Christmas Eve 1975, Stefan Kishko was charged with the murder of 11-year-old Leslie Moles. Not long after, Stefan retracted his confession in the presence of a solicitor, but this made no difference. His trial began in Leeds in July of 1976, and Stefan's defense lawyer was David Wington. David Wington was a successful lawyer and member of the Queen's Counsel. Stefan again repeated that he hadn't killed Lisi and that his confession was false. When asked why he had admitted it, he replied, "I started to tell these lies and they seemed to please them, and the pressure was off. As far as I was concerned, I thought if I admitted what I did to police, they would check out what I said, find it untrue, and would then let me go." On the 21st of July 1976, the jury returned after 5.5 hours of deliberation. Stefan Kishko was found guilty by a 10-2 majority. The judge sentenced him to life in prison for the murder of Lisi Moles. The girls who had come forward saying he had exposed himself were praised by the judge for their bravery and honesty in telling the court their story. The officers were also praised by the judge for their great skill in bringing to justice the person responsible for this dreadful crime, adding, "I would like all the officers responsible for the result to be specially commended." And these observations conveyed to the chief constable. The mother of one of the girls said that Stefan should have been arrested sooner and called for him to be hanged. She said, "Children are a lot safer now this monster has been put away." Kishko was soon transferred to Wakefield Prison, as he was now not only a convicted sex offender but a child killer. He had to be placed on a Rule 43 to protect him from other inmates. 3 years later, Stefan launched an appeal, but this was dismissed. Lord Justice Bridge said, "We can find no grounds whatsoever to condemn the jury's verdict of murder as in any way unsafe or unsatisfactory. The appeal is dismissed." While in prison, Stefan was attacked by fellow inmates. One of these incidents left him needing stitches. As his mental health started to deteriorate, he developed schizophrenia and began to suffer from delusions. His protestations of innocence were labeled as a symptom of his delusions. He was moved from prison to prison, but in 1991 he was admitted to Ashworth Hospital after 6 months of delay for treatment of his declining mental health. Stefan's mother, Charlotte, fought tirelessly to have the case reopened. She was adamant that he hadn't murdered Leslie Molesed and that he had confessed under duress. She took it to her local MP Cyril Smith, but he ignored her pleas for assistance in reopening Stefan's case. She was also stonewalled by Prime Minister James Callaghan and his successor Margaret Thatcher. In 1984 she contacted the human rights organization Justice, who examined miscarriages of justice, and in 1987 she was put in contact with solicitor Campbell Malone. Malone agreed to take on Stefan's case. He consorted with Philip Clee, who had served as junior defense counsel under Wington in Stefan's original trial. Clee had expressed the doubts he had at the time about Stefan's confession and subsequent conviction, and the pair worked together for the next 2 years on a petition for the Home Secretary. The final draft was ready to send to the Home Secretary on October 26, 1989. Coincidentally, that same day David Waddington was appointed to that very position he would resign in 1990 in order to take up peerage and become leader of the House of Lords. He was replaced by Kenneth Baker. It would be 16 months before a police investigation into the trial would begin in February 1991 after receiving help from a private detective named Peter Jackson Malone. Finally convinced the Home Secretary that the case must be reopened, it was then sent to West Yorkshire Police, headed by Detective Superintendent Trevor Wilkinson. This would set in motion an extraordinary chain of events that would blow the case wide open. The police soon discovered that Stefan hadn't been asked if he wanted a lawyer. Although during that time suspects didn't have the right to have a solicitor present, he had asked for his mother Charlotte to be there, but this was refused despite his learning difficulties. Crucially, the police didn't caution him until long after they had decided he was the man they were looking for. The semen found on Leslie's body was also re-examined. Wilkinson found that Stefan was infertile and incapable of producing semen, meaning the sample found on Leslie's body physically could not have come from him. It soon became apparent that they were now dealing with one of the most grave miscarriages of justice the United Kingdom had ever seen. Not only was Stefan Kishko an innocent man who had been in prison since 1976, this also meant that whoever had killed Lisi was still at large. The evidence of the semen had been suppressed by the police and never disclosed to either the defense team nor the jury. They also found that a witness had seen Stefan visiting the grave of his father on the day Leslie had been murdered, and the witness couldn't understand why they hadn't been called to testify. The errors in the investigation just kept on coming. A few months before the murder, Stefan had broken his ankle. This, coupled with the fact he was overweight, meant it would have been incredibly difficult for him to scale the slope where Leslie had been found. This evidence was also not shown to the court. The catalog of errors made by his legal counsel were also in the firing line when it became apparent how badly they had handled his defense. On the first morning of the trial, the Crown delivered thousands of pages of additional and used material. This is where the defense counsel made a huge mistake. They didn't ask for an adjournment to examine them. Instead, they let the trial continue. They used the defense of diminished responsibility, a defense that Stefan hadn't agreed to. They said that he had murdered Lisi after receiving testosterone to treat hypogonadism, and this might have made him behave strangely. The endocrinologist who was treating Stefan vehemently disagreed with this argument, saying the treatment would not have led to that kind of behavior, much less make him inclined to kill. His endocrinologist was never called to testify to this effect. The four girls who said that Stefan had exposed himself to them were now aged 27, 28, 31 and 33. They also had something to say. They admitted they had made up the allegation against Stefan and that he hadn't committed indecent exposure. They said they had done it for a laugh and that at the time it was funny. One of them was interviewed by police on Valentine's Day 1991. She said she wished she hadn't said anything and that she didn't think at the time it would go that far. She said she had gone along with what one of the other girls had said. Another one of the girls said they had seen someone urinating in public, but it wasn't Stefan. She also refused to apologize. One of them was a friend of Leslie's older sister, and she expressed the most remorse she hadn't been called to testify along with the other three, but said that if she had, she would have told the truth and not committed perjury like the others had. Two of the girls received a formal caution by police for the criminal offense they had committed. In August 1991, the new findings were presented to the Home Secretary Kenneth Baker. He immediately handed it over to the Court of Appeal. The judicial investigation began on February 17, 1992, after hearing the plethora of new evidence that proved the wrong man had been convicted. Lord Chief Justice Lane said it has been shown that this man cannot produce sperm. This man consequently cannot have been the murderer. And with that, Stefan Kishko was declared an innocent man and his immediate release from custody was demanded. Anthony Beaumont Darque, Conservative MP said this must be the worst miscarriage of justice of all time. It brings shame on everyone involved in the case. This brought fresh heartbreak for the family of Leslie Moles. Not only did they now have to contend with the fact that an innocent man had gone to prison, but that Leslie's murderer was still out there. During the original trial, they had demanded that Stephen be publicly hanged, and Leslie's father, Frederick Anderson, had shouted a torrent of abuse at Charlotte Kishko after her son had been convicted. After Stephen was proven innocent, the Mole-sided family publicly apologized for what they had said. Lord Lane himself, Ronald Aldridge, the forensic scientist who had worked on the case, and the prosecution barrister Peter Taylor all offered no apology, nor did any of them express any words of remorse or regret for what had happened. The original trial Judge Hugh Park said that while he was sorry for what had happened to Stephen, he was not sorry for how he had handled the trial. The police admitted that they had been wrong, but tried to justify the action taken in 1975. All David Wington said was that had all the evidence been available to him in 1976, the case would have taken a different course. Stephen required further psychiatric treatment until April 1992. He was then released. He had spent more than 16 years in custody. The hunt was now on to find the real killer of Leslie Mole said the first problem was that in 1985, when with Stephen imprisoned and the case being closed, the clothes belonging to Leslie that had been taken from the crime scene had been destroyed. Fortunately, the strips used to remove fibers from Leslie's clothes had been kept. In 1997, a former detective wrote a book about the murder of Leslie Moles and named Raymond Howlett as the man who had most likely taken her life. Hewlett had served with the Scots Guards before becoming a fairground worker. It was after this that he committed a string of appalling sexual assaults. He was sent to prison in 1972 after using paint thinner on a cloth to incapacitate a 12-year-old girl before attacking her on the moors close to his home in Todmorden. Fortunately, she was able to escape. Just 6 years later, another girl was attacked after he pointed a gun at her back, but thankfully she too was able to get away. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for that offense despite 2 stints in prison. In 1988 he committed another attack against a newspaper delivery girl, and he was jailed once again. After this came to light, the family of Leslie Moles campaigned in Todden where he'd lived. They gave out flyers and demanded justice for Leslie. The samples from Leslie's clothes were sent to the Forensic Services Lab in Wetherby, West Yorkshire. After tests, they were able to extract a profile, and finally in 1999 they had the full DNA profile of Leslie Moles' killer, but he wasn't on the National DNA Database. In 2003, DNA profiling was introduced, and this meant the police could check Hewlett's DNA against that of the samples from the crime scene. It came back as no match. The DNA wasn't Raymond Hewlett's. The police were back at square one alongside Raymond Howlett. Another suspect who was soon ruled out was Michael Hahn, who also had a criminal record involving horrific child abuse. In 2001, the News of the World newspaper ran an article saying that they had discovered evidence that Raymond Howlett, Michael Hahn, a third man, were potentially involved in Leslie's death. This was prior to the DNA profiling result. They alleged that Hahn had groomed Leslie in the weeks leading up to her being murdered. This, like all the other stories, would go nowhere, as despite their horrendous criminal convictions, the men had nothing to do with the death of Leslie Moles. It is worth noting that following a lengthy inquiry known as the Leveson Inquiry into the culture, tactics and ethics of the British press, the News of the World newspaper was shut down in 2011. After a plethora of journalistic malpractice and phone hacking scandals were uncovered in November 2006, the news came that people had waited more than 30 years to hear the police had arrested a man after having a direct hit with the DNA taken from the scene. The suspect had provided a DNA sample after being arrested in connection with another sex attack. The previous year, and while he wasn't charged with that offense when they had ran it through the DNA database, it came back as a direct match to a sample found on Leslie's body. The suspect was named as 53-year-old Ronald Castro. I have no knowledge. I've certainly never met a state girl or any member of her family. I have no knowledge as to how he come to say a sample of my DNA found at that place, especially after 30 years. Castro was originally from the Turfile estate in Rodale and had worked as a taxi driver before becoming a comic book dealer. His dreadful reputation preceded him. He was heavily disliked by his neighbors, who said he had an extremely nasty temper. He had an abusive relationship with his wife, and the marriage had ended in divorce in 1997. They shared 2 children. And 2 weeks before Leslie had been murdered, his wife had given birth to a baby that wasn't his. On the day of the murder, she had gone back into hospital, leaving him alone at home. When the police looked into Castor's background, they found a disturbing history of convictions. In 1973, he abducted and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl. He was charged £50 for the offenses of incitement to commit gross indecency and indecent assault. 3 years later, he was convicted again of indecently assaulting a 7-year-old boy. He was told to pay a fine of $50. Ronald Castro was subsequently charged with the murder of Leslie Miles. He appeared in court on November 7, 2006, and was remanded in custody in April the following year. Castro entered his plea not guilty. He was refused bail and sent back to prison to await his trial. During the trial, Dr. Gemma Escott told the jury that the chances of the semen coming from anyone other than Ronald Castro was more than 1 in a billion. The court heard how Castro had abducted Leslie from the street near her home. He then drove her to Richworth, sexually assaulted her, then stabbed her to death in a frenzied, brutal and savage attack before leaving her body at the side of the road on November 12, 2007. The verdict was returned. Ronald Castro was found guilty of the murder of Leslie Miles. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum tariff of 30 years, meaning before he can even apply for parole it will be 2036, and he will be 83 years old. Years of uncertainty and a long wait for justice have finally come to an end for the family of Leslie Moleside. We are relieved that after so long our quest for justice for Leslie is now over. It has been a long and harrowing ordeal, and our gratitude to the friends, family and strangers throughout the world who have given us their support is immense. This is a proud day for West Yorkshire Police. 2. We could never turn the clock back, but what we could do was try and put things right, and I'm proud to have led an excellent team of detectives who have done that today and achieved justice, brought Leslie's killer to justice. There was plenty of emotion in the courtroom behind me this afternoon, but after all, this was the conclusion of a case that's taken more than 3 decades to solve. The fallout from the case of Leslie Miles was both unprecedented and immeasurable. Leslie's family had to go through the trauma of 2 murder trials, as well as the difficult realization that the man who had murdered their beloved Leslie had been walking free for so long. Tragically, in 2014, Leslie's mother April died at the age of 74 in 1994. The surviving senior officer who had worked the original case, Detective Superintendent Dick Holland, as well as the forensic scientist who had worked the case, to Ronald Aldridge, were formally charged with doing acts tending to pervert the course of justice by allegedly suppressing evidence that proved Stefan's innocence, including the scientific tests done on the semen. In May the following year, the case was challenged by defense barristers who argued that the passage of time had made a fair trial impossible and that the case was an abusive process. The presiding magistrate agreed, and the case was not put to a jury. Dick Holland had also served as an officer in the case of Judith Ward, who was accused of committing an IRA bomb attack in 1974. Her conviction would later be declared unsafe, and she was freed after 17 years in prison. Like Stefan, her case was considered to be one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in British criminal history. Holland retired from the force in 1988 and died at the age of 74 in 2007. After Stefan had been released, he was left a physically and emotionally broken man. He became a virtual recluse and showed little interest in anything. When people would approach him to apologize or offer support or encouragement, it would often frighten him. Upon his release, Stefan was promised £500,000 in compensation for his time in prison. He received an interim payment but never the full amount, as on December 23, 1993, less than 2 years after being released from prison, Stefan Kishko suffered a massive heart attack and died at the age of 41. 4 months later, his mother Charlotte, who had fought tirelessly for her son, died at the age of 70. The pair are buried together in Rodale Cemetery. While in prison, Stefan wrote to a family friend saying, "I am in prison for a crime I have not committed. I am missing my mother very much. I hope there will be a happy ending." In 1992, following Stefan's release, the two families who had been torn apart by the murder of Lisi the Mole Seeds and the Kishkos met in person to begin the healing process. Leslie's father, Frederick Anderson, said, "I wasn't sure whether she would accept me into her home. I said some horrible things about Charlotte at the trial for which I cannot apologize enough." Charlotte Kishko harbored no ill will towards the family, saying, "I never blame the family for what happened to Stefan. I've got my son back, but that little girl can never be replaced." Story 5. We begin with a murder investigation that has stunned the entertainment world. One of TV's favorite funny men is dead. Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman was shot to death in his own home, found shot to death today inside his home in Southern California, apparently killed by his wife, who then committed suicide. Many people in the industry are still in shock. Tonight we are live in Rockefeller Center. I'm Kathy Hobbs for the W comedy legend and Saturday Night Live star Philip Edward Hartman started life in Ontario, Canada. Born on September 24, 1948, he came from a big family and began using comedy as a way of getting attention. His family moved to the United States when he was 10 years old, and when Phil started school, he quickly became popular amongst his peers, always joking and making people laugh. It was clear, although he didn't know it, that performing was in his future. He went to California State University and majored in graphic design. As well as undertaking a public speaking course, he loved the outdoor life and spent lots of time fishing and surfing. He was incredibly creative and went on to design several album covers for well-known bands. In the 1960s, he spent time on the road with many bands and artists. He was immersed in the rock and roll lifestyle, and this further fueled his creative spark. At the beginning of 1970, he met and married his first wife, Gretchen Lewis. However, the marriage quickly dissipated and they divorced just 2 years later. Despite spending many years behind the scenes working with bands and designing album covers, he would quickly fall into the spotlight. When he began taking improvisation classes in 1975, Phil Hartman watched an improv group called the Groundlings. When the group asked for a member of the audience to get involved, Phil said he knew instantly that this was something he had to be part of. He auditioned for and joined the famed improv comedy troupe. Shortly thereafter, the Groundlings helped birth the careers of stars such as Will Ferrell, Lisa Kudrow, Kathy Griffin, and Jimmy Fallon, amongst many others. Another notable star was Paul Reubens, famed for his character P.B. Herman. Phil Hartman helped develop this character with Reubens as they were working on the P.B. Herman show for a long time, until the pair parted ways after a falling out. After this, his career began to take off even more, and he was appearing in various pilots, films and commercials. His second wife, Lisa Jarvis, said that while Phil's characters were part of himself, they were also like his armor. She said that although he was an entertainer, creative and passionate, at the same time he was incredibly hard to reach emotionally and withdrew very quickly. A few years after their relationship ended in 1985, Phil met Bren Armdahl on a blind date. Ben originally named Vicky Jo, was stunning and funny, and the chemistry between her and Phil was instant. After modeling for years in her hometown, Brynn made the journey to Los Angeles with the hope of being in show business. She was described as very ambitious and eager to prove herself. It was here that she changed her name from Vicky Jo to Brynn. Before Phil and Brynn met, she had also spent time in rehab for cocaine and abuse. Drugs were an ongoing problem which would mark and impact their relationship throughout its time. Friends would say that when they were good they were great, but the frequent arguments and volatility between the pair was clear for all to see. In 1986, Phil Hartman made an incredible leap in his career. He was asked to audition for Saturday Night Live for comedians and comedic actors. SNL was where it was happening, and becoming a cast member was a highly sought after and coveted job. Onlookers hung on his every word during his audition, and it came as no surprise when he was offered a spot. His impressions of people such as Bill Clinton and Frank Sinatra became iconic, and the audience and cast adored him. His good friend and fellow SNL writer Dana Kaufman described him as a generous and supportive performer that always wanted to make the rest of the cast look as good as possible. SNL put Phil Hartman and his amazing comedic capabilities firmly in the public eye, and he soon became a fan favorite. He won an Emmy for his contributions to the Saturday Night Live writing team. He was also nicknamed Glue by fellow performers for his abilities to hold the show together and help out the other performers where needed. Despite their issues, Brynn and Phil married in 1987 and quickly became quite the Hollywood power couple. At the end of Phil Hartman's second season of Saturday Night Live, he and Brynn welcomed their first child, a son named Sean. Upon hearing the joyful news, Phil's ex-wife, Lisa Jarvis, sent a letter to the family offering to help look after the baby should they ever need it. She said she received an abusive death threat back from Brynn. Phil took to being a father quickly, and his baby boy Sean was his pride and joy. The family began splitting their time between New York and Los Angeles, and he and Brynn had a second baby, a little girl named Bergen. Phil and Brynn seemed to have it all, but friends of the star said it was clear that the cracks in the relationship were very apparent. People that knew the couple said that Phil didn't like confrontation and struggled to open up emotionally, whereas Brynn was very vocal but often chose the worst times to start the conversations. Brynn began to show up to the Saturday Night Live set more frequently, and cast and crew members often saw heated arguments between the two during a table read-through for a new episode of the show. Brynn turned up to the set and began sitting on various men's laps and flirting with different people, although Phil didn't seem to pay much attention. In a bid to keep the peace, the other cast members were left feeling uncomfortable. People felt this was an attempt by Brynn to get attention from Phil, as she was feeling lonely and insecure in the marriage, as well as prescription drugs. Brynn had relapsed and started drinking and using cocaine again. Although this was noticed by members of the SNL cast, it wasn't uncommon at the time. Alcohol and drugs were a frequent feature among many, a dressing room with some stars as famous for their drug taking as their comedy. Friends also said that Brynn had become resentful of Phil's career and wanted her own shot at being in the limelight. Phil argued that he was the breadwinner for the family and everything he did was for them. Phil also told friends that he would often have to restrain Brynn when she became physical during fights, as well as his work on SNL. Phil accepted various roles on The Simpsons, further cementing his place in pop culture. In 1995, after 8 seasons on Saturday Night Live, Phil Hartman decided to step away from the show. He is still regarded as one of the finest comedic talents to ever appear on SNL, and fellow casting crew members said there was a definite void when he left. He was working hard on a pilot for his show entitled The Phil Show, in which he would make sure Ben got a leading role. However, the pilot never made it to air, and Brynn was reportedly devastated at not being able to work with her husband on this project. Instead, Phil signed up to be part of a new sitcom called News Radio working alongside many a famous face. He was earning around $50,000 an episode and was at the height of his career. Bryn and their 2 children moved permanently to a $1.4 million mansion in Enino, California for Phil to focus on the sitcom and his family. Despite his professional accolades, he couldn't escape his personal turmoil in his marriage and the explosive arguments. Continued on Mother's Day 1997. Bryn came home late, reportedly drunk and high on cocaine. Phil was horrified and said if this behavior continued he would have to divorce her and take the children. He said if she didn't check into rehab the marriage was over. Bryn checked into a rehab in Arizona the following day but left after less than a week, claiming she didn't need to be there after a 4th season of news radio was commissioned. Phil decided to take a summer break to spend more time with his family and work on his marriage. Phil and Bryn Hartman also reached their 11-year anniversary May 27, 1998. Despite their marital issues, they always aimed to have a weekly date night while their children spent time with a nanny. On May 27, their day began with the couple talking about what they would do for their weekly date. According to sources, Phil had gotten his days confused and forgotten about the date night, which sparked yet another argument. Phil left the family home to go shopping and get some space, and Bryn decided she was going to head out too, leaving the children with the nanny. She started getting ready for an evening out with a friend sometime around 7:30 p.m. Ben Hartman went to meet her friend Christine Zander for dinner and drinks, telling the nanny she would be home to see the children off to bed. Christine Zander was a producer and writer, and friends of Bryn speculated she may have been hoping for Christine to create a part for her in an upcoming project. Her friend Christine said she did seem in good spirits and in a positive frame of mind. Around 9:30 p.m. Phil arrived at home and let the nanny go. He put the children to bed and headed to bed himself. Around 9:45 Bryn asked Christine if she wanted to carry on drinking in another bar, but Christine couldn't stay out any later. While Christine went to the bathroom, she said that Bryn made a phone call which she was worried may have been to score drugs. They said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. At 10:15 p.m. Bryn drove across town to Studio City to go to her friend and ex-lover Ron Douglas' house. They drank beer and caught up with Bryn, attempting to briefly call Phil, but he didn't pick up the phone. Just before midnight, Ron told Bryn that it was best for her to head home as he didn't want any issues with Phil. When Bryn arrived home at around 1 a.m. she began using cocaine. Although what happened next is speculation, it is understood that she and Phil would have argued. Phil didn't want to fight and decided to go back to sleep, leaving Bryn to her own devices. Sometime before 3:00 a.m. Bryn, already intoxicated, snorted another line of cocaine and grabbed one of Hartman's many guns. She entered the bedroom and shot her husband 3 times as he slept, between the eyes, in the throat, and in his chest. Their 9-year-old son Sean woke up to what he thought was a door slamming, and he heard his mother crying. Heavily intoxicated, manic, and in a state of shock, Bryn got in her car and drove to see her friend Ron Douglas. She was frantic and immediately confessed to killing Phil. However, due to Bryn's often erratic nature, Ron didn't initially believe her. It was clear that she was in a drug-induced state, and he assumed that they had simply had another argument. He attempted to sober her up, and at around 6:00 a.m. Ron was fairly satisfied that she was able to drive, but Bryn wanted Ron to go back to the house with her. Ron said that while they were talking, a gun fell out of Bryn's purse and he immediately knew he had to follow her car back to the house. Upon entering the bedroom, Ron saw Phil Hartman. It was clear that nothing could be done and he was already deceased. Ron Douglas phoned 911 and said during this time Bryn barricaded herself in the bedroom with Phil's body. She phoned her sister and asked her to take care of Sean and Bergen. At 6:20 a.m. the police surrounded Hartman's home. They find a visibly Distressed Sean at the front of the house hearing the police encroaching, Bryn lay next to her husband and shot herself. We begin with a murder investigation that has stunned the entertainment world. Phil Hartman, who gained fame on Saturday Night Live, was found shot dead in his home, apparently killed by his wife, who then committed suicide. ABC's Carla Will has more from Los Angeles at 6:20 this morning. Residents of this upscale and Chino neighborhood called police to report gunshots coming from the Hartman's gated estate. Officers arrived to find a 9-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl by the front door, both obviously upset. As they were taking the children out of the house, officers heard a gunshot in the master bedroom. There they discovered comedian Phil Hartman dead. Authorities say it appears his wife Bryn shot him, then turned the gun on herself. Mr. Hartman had been dead for a while. He did not die at the same time that Mrs. Hartman apparently killed herself. As the story began to break, the world was in a state of shock in the days and weeks following on from the devastating event. Many theories began to circulate, one of which was there was an affair going on between Ron Douglas and Bryn Hartman, which culminated in a crime of passion. Another theory was that Bryn was hoping to attempt to frame Ron for the murder, and that's why she drove to his house with the gun. No theory has ever been proven. Ron Douglas flatly denied any involvement and said that until he got to the house he had no idea what had happened. It will never be known what was going on inside the mind of Bryn Hartman in the early hours of May 28, as well as a high level of cocaine. The antidepressant Zoloft was in Bryn's system and her blood alcohol level was 0.12%, well above the legal limit. Bryn had told friends that she had been prescribed Zoloft by her children's doctor, but that it made her feel strange and out of her own body. Medical examiners looked into the side effect of Zoloft and whether this could have altered her state of mind that night, as well as disorientation and hallucinations. It can occasionally bring on suicidal feelings. Many of Bryn's family members believe this drug could have played a key role in the events that took place that fateful night in 1999. The Hartman estate filed a lawsuit against Pfizer, the pharmaceutical company that produces the drug Zoloft, claiming there were little warnings about the side effects and danger of mixing the drug with alcohol. The family did receive an out-of-court settlement from Pfizer before it ever went to court. However, the theory surrounding the impact of Zoloft remains an uncertain area, as levels of the drug in Bryn's system were low, according to the toxicology report. In the early hours of May 28, 1999, 2 young children lost their parents, family and friends lost their loved ones, and the world felt the loss of an incredible talent. Sean and Bergen Hartman went to live with their aunt and uncle in Wisconsin and were raised under a different name to shield them from the public eye. Sean took after his father and is an artist and musician, carving a creative career for himself. Bergen has degrees in journalism and communication from university and has her own business. She even made a special appearance on SNL's 40th anniversary celebration in 2015 to honor her father. Both children dedicated a memorial to their parents in Greenwood Cemetery. The deaths of Phil and Bryn Hartman shocked the world, but Phil Hartman's amazing comedic talent continued to live on through the world of entertainment, his friends, family, and their children. Story 6. Helen Elizabeth Bailey was born on the 22nd of August 1964 in Northumberland, England. She was a popular children's author and is probably most remembered for her series The Crazy World of Electra Brown. She had originally intended to become a forensic scientist but quickly fell in love with media and worked on marketing and licensing campaigns for characters in the Rugrats and Garfield. When Helen was 23, she met the man who would later become her husband. In 1996 she married John Sinfield, the head of a licensing rights company, and she soon started writing more, throwing herself into her children and teenage stories. This creative outlet quickly turned into a flourishing career, and her books were Incredibly popular and well loved, but in February 2011 tragedy struck. She and her husband John were holidaying in Barbados when he went for a morning swim in the sea, but before long Helen heard John cry out from the water. He had become caught in a riptide and tragically he drowned. They had been together for 22 years. By way of helping the grieving process, Helen threw herself into her writing. She started a blog called Planet Grief. It was a way of processing her own emotions, and it allowed for others affected by grief and loss to reach out and share their stories too. Very much a community-based blog where anyone was welcome. Helen would post suggested readings and websites that might help other people through the various stages of grief. Her openness and honesty made her easy to connect with, and through her blog and her memoir she helped many other people going through the same things. The book is based on my blog Planet Grief, which I started after my husband drowned whilst we were on holiday in Barbados in February 2011. And if you think it's going to be just another misery memoir, a miserable misery memoir, well, some of it is miserable, but some of it is actually very funny, even though I didn't realize it would be at the time. So although I do cry when I take the wheelie bins out or become hysterical buying a single Scotch egg, I also tell you about bereavement therapists who were crazier than I was, going to parties on my own and during Christmas, and eventually dating. To grieve is to mourn the loss of someone or something that we care deeply about, whether that's because of death, divorce, or some other traumatic life event. If you're in that space right now, I really hope that the book brings you some comfort. But whatever your circumstances, I hope that you just have a very enjoyable read. It was through Planet Grief that in October 2011 Helen met Ian Stewart. Ian's wife Diane had died very suddenly in 2010. Their relationship began just as supportive friends, but they soon became a lot closer, and Helen would describe their union as two grieving families coming together. The pair began dating and eventually became engaged. They moved into a beautiful gated home together in the picturesque town of Royston in Herefordshire. They lived with Ian's two sons and Helen's beloved dog Boris, who had come from Helen's marriage to John. It seemed that after so much tragedy in both of their lives, they had eventually found happiness again. However, on the 15th of April, just before 4 p.m., 999 received a phone call. Officer, please second the help. Hello there, my partner has been missing since Monday and not contacted anyone. Said she was going away, hasn't gone anywhere. She said she was going, so we've just decided we should report it. What's your partner's name? Helen Bailey. And what's her date of birth? Oh cry. She's phoned me there. 22nd, right, just let me double check 1 second. 22nd of August 1954. She's gone away. Was that for work, business? Sorry, no, she's self-employed, so she works from home. No, she left a note. She said in the note something like, I need space and time alone. I'm going to Broadstairs. Please don't contact me in any way. But in Broadstairs we've got a cottage down there, but people have been down there with neighbors and she's not there. And her phone is just dead. It's not what I say dead, it just doesn't ring, it just goes straight to the answering machine. Did Helen go in the vehicle? No, she didn't. She left her car here. She did take her dog with her. She's got a little dachshund. When was the last time you saw her? Monday afternoon before about 4 to 3:20 to 3. What sort of time did you realize the note had been left? Oh, I don't know, 4:45, something like that. And was that note a bit of a shock? Were you expecting it at all? No, I wasn't. Well, yes, it was a shock. She has talked about it, but it was still a shock. She has talked about wanting space because things just haven't been going well for her recently, or for us. Okay, so she mentioned wanting space, but she's never actually acted on it. She's not left before. She's never done anything like this before. This may sound silly, but she's definitely not at home. No, I've literally checked everywhere. We have got quite a large house, but I've literally checked everywhere. And is she ever likely to be a victim of any sort of abuse that you know of? No, she's a very strong person. It's very hard to abuse Helen. And can I please take down her Contact number if that's okay. Of course it is. I'm going to have to look it up because it's something I can never remember. It's just in my phone, if you know what I mean. Yes, no problem. So it's just a question of waiting. There's nothing else you do at this stage. I can say we'll just do our initial inquiries, and yet it's just a case of waiting. Unfortunately, okay, as well as her home in Royston, she had another property in Kent by the seaside somewhere she would often go to write and take some time for herself, but it was clear that neither she nor anyone else had been there in quite some time. By all accounts it appeared that Helen had left a few days prior with her dog Boris to get some space and clear her head, but nobody had heard from her since, and this was extremely out of character for Helen. Her neighbors and close friends wondered if her stressful work schedule had caused her to drop off the grid for a while. Days turned into weeks, and with no trace of Helen turning up anywhere. 6 weeks after Helen disappeared, the police started to expand their search. From what I understand from what we've discussed and what I've been told by the investigation is that Helen was last seen on Monday, April 11th. Yes, is that correct? Yes. Okay, I would like you to take me through what happened that day. This is where I can't remember very well. I'll tell you what I can remember, but what I certainly can't remember is maybe what I've said since and when I've looked in the diary and things like that. Okay, when I got to the solicitor's, he went through the paperwork I'd taken, and I realized I'd only taken very old paperwork. I'd left half of it here, so I dashed back. While I dashed back, I drove back, wasn't sure what happened, saw the other paperwork on the side, shouted for Helen. Helen wasn't there, so I thought at that stage she was just walking the dog over to her neighbors. I went back to the solicitors. There was no one in town. Just dropped the paper, didn't stay, dropped the paper off the camera. Helen still wasn't here, and then I started to think she is gone. She has gone to Broadstairs. They also took another look at her seaside cottage in Broadstairs, Kent, and examined her Wi-Fi router. Her phone had been going to voicemail since she had last been seen on Monday, April 11th, but it seemed that on the April 16th there was a glimmer of hope that she had in fact been there. Helen Bailey's mobile phone had briefly connected to the Wi-Fi in her cottage. Police wondered if Helen had in fact been in Broadstairs the whole time. Following this, a closer look at her bank transactions gave them more hope that Helen was still out there, as there had been activity on her account. A new appeal was made, and police now wondered if Helen was using another name to avoid being detected. Further analysis of the accounts showed that a standing order from Helen's personal account to her joint account had been increased. It had gone from £600 a month to £4,000 a month. Her bank card had also been used to renew an Arsenal season ticket costing £3,000. It soon became clear that it wasn't Helen moving this money around at all. It was her partner Ian Stewart. Police went back to the house that Ian shared with Helen. They knew they urgently needed to speak to him, but Ian wasn't there. He had left to go on a 2-week Spanish holiday that both he and Helen were meant to go on together. Neighbors were baffled that Ian had left the country with everything going on at the time, but detectives sat tight and waited for him to return on July 11, 3 months after Helen Bailey had last been seen. Officers arrived at the home she shared with Ian, and just after 7:00 a.m. Ian was arrested. Police were likely to interrupt the caller and the theft of money from Helen Bailey, so you do not have to say anything but remain calm and defensive. If you want to mention any question, front me. You may turn around in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence. Do you want to say anything? Yes, I do. All right, you may sit down. I don't know why. Okay, we're going to speak to you at the police station. All right, we're going to speak to you at the police station. So what needs to happen? You need to get some clothes on, okay, and then you need to go to the police station, and these officers will transport you to the police station, and then you'll have a chance of being interviewed at the police station. Okay. Police carried out a more extensive search of the couple's property, and on July 15 they finally found Helen Bailey. Her body was discovered in the House's cesspit beneath the garage alongside her body was her beloved dog Boris. It was determined that she had been suffocated, but it was inconclusive as to whether or not she was suffocated and definitely dead before she was put in there, or whether she suffocated to death while inside the cesspit. It was a truly harrowing and terrifying question. DCI Kent said of Ian, he knows every time he uses the facilities in the house that's where it's going. That's an incredibly cruel and cynical way to dispose of someone you claim to love and were set to marry. Ian had purposely parked the Jeep over the top of the cesspit during the police's initial searches to prevent it from being detected. Ian Stewart was subsequently charged with the murder of Helen Bailey. You're the last person to see her alive. You wait 4 days to report her missing. You're vague about your movements on the 11th, at best vague. You take it you've to the tip on the 11th. You don't report her missing for 4 days. The following day you go to Broadstairs. I don't know why. Did you go there? Did you see Helen on the 16th? Because according to the technical information we've got, her phone is in Broadstairs and you're in Broadstairs. Was Helen there? She wasn't. Was she, or was she? You tell me. Did you kill Helen Bailey? Did you intend to kill her, or was this an accident? What happened? Did you just lose control, just lose at some big argument and you killed her, and you've been covering up ever since? Because if that's what's happened, you need to tell us now, because this could be your last opportunity to speak to the police about this. You are here on suspicion of murder. You need to tell us what happened. There's transactions where it clearly shows from what I've seen that you have taken money, or someone has taken money, which I believe to be you, from her account into your joint account, which you have obviously access to. Therefore you've now got access to an extra £12,000. You will have benefited from her death. Is that correct? Why do you say that financially you will have benefited from her death? Would you not say it seemed that Ian had been plotting for quite some time? Helen Bailey had written up her will in 2012, in which she had left her fortune to her brother John, stepson Daniel, and friend Jenny, but in 2014 she changed it so that Ian would inherit the majority of her assets and he wouldn't be left financially vulnerable. Helen also took out a life insurance policy to cover a potential £1.22 million inheritance tax bill in case she died before they got married. Several months before Helen was killed in February of 2016, Ian began giving her the sleeping aid Zopicone, which had been prescribed to him for sleeping problems. He often crushed it up and put it in her breakfast in the morning. Over the next few months Helen became concerned about her energy levels and sleeping. She made several internet searches that included "why do I keep falling asleep?" and falling asleep in the afternoon. On Monday, April 11, 2016, Helen spent the morning looking at wedding venues and sending emails sometime between 10:51 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. Ian drugged Helen into a stupefied state, but the timing of her death is still inconclusive. He disposed of her body in the cesspit beneath the garage of the house, and shortly after he threw in her dog Boris as well. It was a truly callous and cold-hearted crime. After this, Ian increased the standing order to transfer money from Helen's bank account to their joint Santander account. Ian was supposed to visit the doctor's surgery just before 3 p.m. but he phoned the GP and said he was having car trouble and asked to rearrange his appointment for later on. After he visited the GP, he was caught on camera making a trip to the refuge center to dispose of a duvet. Following this, he met with Helen's solicitor and tried to hastily push through the sale of one of Helen's houses. Helen's solicitor described him as quite aggressive. He refused to discuss the matter any further on the basis that Helen wasn't present that evening. Ian went to watch his son play bowls before buying a Chinese takeaway for them both. He sent a text message to her phone with just 2 kisses in the message. A few days passed and Helen's family and friends were becoming concerned that they hadn't heard from her. They contacted Ian, which prompted him to phone the police and report her as missing. No one saw the notes that Helen allegedly left on the side, and police believed it was all part of a web of lies that Ian was spinning. On April 16, 2016, Ian drove to Helen's cottage in Kent with her mobile phone. When he got there, Helen's phone briefly connected to the Wi-Fi. He then continued to live his life as if nothing had happened. DCI Jerome Kent, who led the investigation, said Ian Stewart was the most bizarre, manipulative, greedy and self-centered man he had ever met. The murder appeared to be based on nothing more than pure greed. In January of 2017, the trial of Ian Stewart began. In his own defense, Ian Stewart claimed that Helen and her dog Boris had been kidnapped on April 11, 2016 by two men called Nick and Joe. He said he hadn't told the police about this to keep Helen safe, but the elusive Nick and Joe demanded £500 in ransom money. Ian said he spoke to Helen for the last time on a phone belonging to one of the men on April 15. Following this claim, Ian was presented with two men in court. The prosecution believed that they had found the men, that Ian had based the descriptions of the kidnappers on. Nick Cook was Stewart's next-door neighbor, and Joe Capullo, who Ian had known for several years prior in his old home. Ian admitted to knowing both the men, but said they didn't match the description of the kidnappers. Several of Helen's neighbors gave evidence that they had seen Helen walking Boris on the day she disappeared. Another witness claimed that he saw Helen in Broadstairs near her cottage. This was after April 11, but under cross-examination, this witness admitted that the sighting could have been back in March, before she was considered missing, and that he hadn't thought about this sighting until a journalist had interviewed him after a 7-week trial and just 6 hours of deliberation. On February 22, 2017, the jury found Ian Stewart guilty of the murder of Helen Bailey at St. Albans Crown Court. The next day, Judge Andrew Bright sentenced him. Ian Stewart refused to appear via video link to hear his sentencing. Judge Bright said it was difficult to imagine a more heinous crime. Ian Stewart was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 34 years. He will be 90 years old before he becomes eligible for parole. DCI Jerome Kent said that although it was the correct and right verdict, there were no winners in this case. As a result of this case, detectives began re-examining the death of Ian Stewart's previous wife Diane, who had died after an epileptic seizure at the couple's home in 2010. In August 2018, Ian Stewart was arrested on suspicion of Diane's murder. If all goes to plan, the trial is set for 2022. Helen Bailey helped and inspired so many people with her compassion, openness and honesty. She met a tragic end at the hands of someone she believed had bought her the happiness she had been missing. The work on her blog, Planet Grief, and her book When Bad Things Happen in Good Bikinis gave many people suffering from loss and grief support, help and ultimately hope for the future. Story 7. This case takes us to Sydney, Australia, and back to April 27, 2010. 6:30 p.m. The streets around Chatswood were peaceful. People were coming home from work and getting ready to settle in for the evening. That was until the desperate screams of a woman shattered the stillness. A couple walking their dog along Holland Street went over to investigate. They saw a man wearing a green hooded jacket and carrying a backpack running away from the house the screaming had come from. They had tried to challenge him, but he quickly ran off and disappeared. As the couple moved closer to the house, they found a woman on the verge. She had suffered horrific injuries, and it was clear that nothing could be done to save her. Michelle Beats had been murdered on her own doorstep. Michelle had just arrived home from work at the Royal North Shore Hospital. She had been born in New Zealand and attended Epsom Girls Grammar School in Auckland, and later worked in the heart department at Green Lane Hospital. Since moving to Sydney, she had worked in the emergency department at Royal North Shore Hospital for 25 years. And the past 10 years had been as a nurse unit manager. As with all jobs in healthcare, it was extremely hard and stressful. It was long hours with massive workloads, but Michelle took it all in her stride. She was described as quiet and reserved, but she didn't take nonsense from anyone. Michelle was very popular and well respected amongst her peers. This was what made the news of her murder so hard to process. Who on earth would want to hurt her and hurt her so violently? Police thought maybe she had disturbed someone robbing her house, but this theory was quickly shot down. The electricity to her house had been cut off deliberately at a junction box by the front door. This meant that both the outdoor sensor light and the alarm system to the property had been disabled. Her shed door also appeared to have been tampered with. She had been ambushed in a planned attack. Her throat had been cut and she had been stabbed multiple times in her chest, head and throat before being left to bleed to death on her veranda. The police began looking into the personal records of staff members at the hospital. Michelle had reported drugs being stolen and a member of staff had been fired as a result. Maybe a disgruntled former colleague would have a clues. More than 20 markers led away from the property, heading along the footpath in the direction of Johnson Street. It was reported that they indicated the path her killer had taken. As he ran away, the police also appealed for the public's help in tracking down this man. Michelle's day had been a typical one. She had gone to work and then stopped to get groceries. On the way back to the home she shared with her partner David, who was very quickly ruled out as being involved. Chatswood was a low-crime area. It was a safe neighborhood, so people were understandably stunned and very frightened, and for her colleagues at the hospital, they were completely crushed. New South Wales Health called her a valued and esteemed colleague, friend and mentor. She was an exemplary nurse, a dear friend and teammate. We are devastated by her loss. Dr. Robert Day, the deputy director of the emergency department she worked in, said the department had lost a friend and leader. There was speculation that a patient with mental health problems had killed her, but the police were quick to dispute that. That is not correct. Superintendent Terrence Dalton said it's an ongoing homicide investigation. Police are looking into the victimology of the victim, which includes looking into her complete background, everything about her. A number of her work colleagues have been interviewed thus far. Statements have been taken. Her family have been spoken to, and the police will continue along those lines of inquiry. They also shut down rumors that David was in protective custody on the night she was killed. She was due to have dinner with David and an old friend, Fran, someone she had grown up with. Fran was over in Australia for a dragon boat racing competition, and they had arranged to meet up and have a long overdue catch-up. He would cancel the dinner and return to New Zealand, and he was left in total shock when he found out what had happened to his friend. The gruesome way she died is unbelievable, he said. In speaking to people, one name had come up. Michelle had told people she worked with at the hospital that a man had been starting to freak her out. 48-year-old Walter Marsh. Walter Marsh was a former U.S. Marine. He had worked at the Royal North Shore Hospital with Michelle. He had arrived in Sydney in February the previous year and had a 12-month contract with the hospital. He said that he could remember seeing Michelle a few times while he worked there, but he said they hadn't fallen out or anything of the sort. But upon digging further, this didn't appear to be true. He had been on a 12-month contract, but in early 2010 this hadn't been renewed. He blamed Michelle for this. He believed that she had given him bad references, which stopped him from finding further employment. He needed a job to be able to stay in Australia. He didn't want to go back to the United States as he had a massive child support bill waiting for him. He was a firm person of interest, and he certainly did seem to have a motive for wanting to hurt Michelle. Walter had gone back to the hospital just a few days after the murder, but this time as a patient, as he had suffered a seizure. Her colleagues were treating the man they knew was the prime suspect in her killing. Even though his name and identity were not being released at this point, he did continue to speak to the media, who blurred his face. He denied any involvement. Did you kill Michelle Bates? No, he said he liked Michelle and he enjoyed the people he worked with. I enjoyed the eclectic mix of personalities and thought we all got along wonderfully. He said he added that he thought he was being targeted because he was not Australian. He was adamant that he was innocent. He said the police had made up their minds that he was involved, but he had nothing to do with it. I'm not a killer and I certainly would never harm a woman. He said the police think that just because I have a military background that I am a killer. I'm not. He said that Michelle had been the one to interview him over the phone when he was in America for the job and she had sponsored his visa. He said that although his contract hadn't been renewed, this hadn't jeopardized his visa and he bore no grudge towards Michelle. His apartment was also searched over the course of 3 days, hoping that vital clues or evidence would be found. He said that on the night of the murder he had met his wife at a nearby train station at around 7:00 p.m. after she had finished work and they had gone home together. But how did he account for the fact that there was CCTV footage of him throwing a backpack away into a bin at a local shopping center? I was always going to throw away that bag, it's no big deal, he said. To try and find the backpack, the police searched through tons of rubbish across various sites but found nothing. Even though the police had spoken to him twice, there was not enough evidence to charge him, but that would soon change. The investigation into Walter continued and the police finally got the lead they had been looking for. He was taken to the station for a third time. Did you know where she lived? No. You ever been to her house? No. Were you ever trying to use knives? No. In his police interview, Walter Marsh said he was astounded when he heard about the murder of his former boss. I was horrified. I was terrified that somebody would do that. Did you murder Michelle Woods? No. The officers also spoke to his wife. She said that on the night of the murder, just half an hour after the fact, he had said to her, I did it, it's done, the __ is gone, no more bad references. He also practiced throat-slitting techniques on his wife and brother-in-law, techniques used by the Marines to kill someone quickly and quietly. Walter Marsh was subsequently arrested at his Lane Cove apartment, and 3 weeks after the killing he was charged with the murder of Michelle Beets. He was refused bail. A former U.S. Marine will stand trial for the murder of Michelle Beets. Walter Marsh is accused of killing the nursing manager with a knife at her Chatswood home in April. His wife and brother-in-law gave evidence against him. At a committal hearing, they said he practiced his knife technique at home and hated his former boss. A magistrate today referred the case to trial in the Supreme Court. Michelle's brother Marty said the news of him being charged was fantastic. Of course we must now see justice do its course. We just have to let the be long until it goes to court that you're believing it's happening. Michelle's father Robbie said he was happy with the news but did express enormous empathy for Walter's family too. I feel sorry for Mr. Marsh's wife and for his family in the US. I hope the trial will be speedy, correct, and come to a proper end, he said. Walter Marsh, a 49-year-old former U.S. Marine, is due to face a committal hearing next month. He hasn't yet entered a plea to the charge of murder. Documents tended to the court say that Walter Marsh's wife and brother-in-law are due to testify against him. The papers reveal that the case against Mr. Marsh will include admissions he allegedly made to his wife about the killing. Walter had no reply to the charges and the judge accepted this silence as a plea of not guilty, meaning that this would be going to trial. He was also found to not have any substantial impairment or mental illness. The man accused of murdering Sydney nurse Michelle Beets is on life support after a failed suicide attempt. Walter Marsh was rushed to hospital on Saturday morning after he was found in his prison cell with his wrists and throat cut. A suicide note was reportedly also found in the cell. Marsh is alleged to have stalked and then killed Michelle Beets at her Chatswood home in April this year after the attempt on his life had failed, and he was released from hospital. The trial of Walter Marsh would begin. It would emerge that Walter had actually been planning this and stalking Michelle for weeks. He had observed her house to work out what security systems she may have had and what the layout inside was. Walter wanted to know what her pattern and her routine was, so he would call her home phone multiple times each day from Payaneses to see when she usually got back. She even saw him on her street on one occasion. This was why she had told colleagues he was really starting to freak her out on the day of the murder. Michelle had changed her routine. Instead of driving into her driveway, she had backed in instead, meaning that she had come face to face with him. He had sat in wait with a balaclava over his face. He even had his knife sharpened in preparation. It also emerged that he had asked his brother-in-law to go with him to Michelle's house to keep watch for him, and he had also bought clothes from a second-hand store to wear specifically during the murder. He had told her that if she stopped screaming he wouldn't hurt her, but he then slit her throat using the technique he had learned in the military and repeatedly stabbed her. The prosecution argued that Walter had developed a deep resentment and hatred of Michelle, as he believed that she had given him bad references which had stopped him from finding a job. He had referred to her as a ____ on more than one occasion and said she needed to be gone. Michelle's partner, David Grant, was there for the start of the trial, which he says presents the opportunity for justice. Investigators claim Marsh had cut off the power to the house and broken a back door to make it look like a break-in. This is the couple that discovered Michelle Bede's bloody body on her front doorstep last year. Caramel and Gordon B. Venon had been walking down Holland Street when they say they heard a woman scream, then the sound of slapping. Mr. B. Venon said when he felt for Miss Bede's pulse, he felt the gash in her neck. He says she turned towards him as if she was trying to speak. Then after they made eye contact, she died. The couple are two of 70 witnesses expected to be called in the trial of Walter Marsh. The two key witnesses in the trial are Marsh's Vietnamese wife Samantha and her brother. The jury heard 3 weeks after the incident. Samantha told police Marsh had confessed. The court heard Samantha Marsh and her brother had reason to lie after cooperating with police. They both received protection from prosecution for concealing a serious offense. Mrs. Marsh also received a visa to stay in Australia and money for accommodation. The jury was shown security camera footage which showed a man walking around Chatswood in the hour following the murder. Detective Senior Constable Scott Bennett, who worked on the case, took the jury through the footage, which started at around 6:30 p.m. The man was dressed in a white shirt with black bottoms and was carrying both a bum bag and a plastic bag as he walked west on Victoria Avenue and headed into the Chatswood shopping center. He went into an accessible toilet and then into the men's toilet before going to the food court and putting things into the rubbish bin. Scott Bennett said that Walter had significantly altered his appearance since his arrest, but he believed he was the man on the footage. Police claimed Marsh was captured on CCTV at Chatswood Chase Shopping Center about an hour after the alleged murder, but his lawyer told the court the figure in the video may not be his client, adding the place is well lit with people around and whoever committed that murder would have been covered in blood. The court heard that Walter, who had been born in Belfast, had told his wife that he had permission to kill from an organization. His wife said that around a month before the murder he had said, "Finally I got permission from the organization in Ireland to kill Michelle Bedes." Samantha Marsh says about a week before the death her husband bought a set of unusual clothes, some shoes and a pair of rubber gloves. Mrs. Marsh said she saw her husband wear the outfit once but then never saw the clothes or the gloves again. Mrs. Marsh added on the 27th of April last year her husband told her he'd changed in a nearby garage, then got rid of his old clothes, the gloves and the knife. It also emerged that in the weeks before Michelle's murder Walter had been plotting another one, that of his ex-wife back in the United States. The prosecutor said he had flown back to America with the intention of murdering his first wife because of his unpaid $50,000 child support bill, but Ultimately it didn't happen and he didn't kill his ex-wife. It shows some degree of pre-planning. The prosecutor said he thought he would solve the problem by murdering his ex-wife, then it turned to murdering Michelle Beets. In November the jury had reached their guilty verdict in the trial of the man accused of murdering Sydney nurse Michelle Beets. 10's Gabrielle Boll has been following the case and she joins us now. Gabrielle, Walter Marsh has always maintained his innocence, so how did he react to this conviction when the guilty verdict was handed down? A loud round of applause erupted from the public gallery. The family and friends of Michelle Beets were clearly absolutely delighted with the result. It has to be said though, the reaction of the murderer was quite bizarre to say the very least. He smiled, he giggled, he joked with his lawyer, he acted very casual, he took repeated sips of water, sat back in the dock and looked very relaxed as he was led away to his cell. Interestingly, he made a tut motion to the victims' friends and family. What exactly that was meant to mean perhaps we will never know. After an unimaginable loss, a small measure of relief for the family and friends of Michelle Beets. I'm personally very relieved with the result today. It's been a long, hard 18 months for myself, Michelle's family and friends. We just want you to know what a beautiful, wonderful person she was, and she so sadly missed the face of a killer with no remorse. Justice Derek Price said nothing other than the maximum penalty was appropriate for his barbaric crime. The level of the offender's culpability in the commission of the offense is so extreme that the community interest in retribution, punishment, community protection and deterrence can only be met by a sentence of life imprisonment. He told his wife that he wanted to confront Miss Beets by pretending to distribute Mormon books and by wearing a Mormon uniform to freak her out and scare her. However, his intention became an intention to kill. The manner in which he killed her was cruel, merciless and abhorrent. The offender's crime falls within the worst category of murder. I'm just happy that he's off the streets and can't cause any more harm to anyone else. I agree with Justice Price that it certainly was in the worst category. It's unclear if Walter Marsh was even listening to what was being said inside court. He ignored a request by the judge for him to stand for his final sentence and had to be prompted by his lawyer. Marsh could appeal against the severity of his sentence, but David Grant says he hopes today's judgment will see any such challenge fail. Carl her ABC News Sydney, this wasn't just a victory for her family but also for the police who would help bring him to justice. Although nothing was going to bring Michelle back, knowing that the person who had killed her would now spend the rest of his life behind bars did bring some degree of comfort. As previously said, Walter Marsh had been speaking to the media and one of them was journalist Clementine Cuneo, and she had an extraordinary story to tell about her interactions with Walter Marsh over 2 weeks. In March last year, I formed an uncomfortable bond with Marsh. We spoke often over the phone as he repeatedly denied he was the killer. Then one Tuesday, as I visited the hairdresser, he called again. He said he needed to tell me something and that it wasn't particularly good. As he spoke, he began explaining to me that when people are desperate, they do desperate things. He rambled incoherently for a few minutes, but I kept listening, keen to work out what he was on about. I needed the money, Marsh said. Then the penny dropped. I asked Marsh, Walter, what are you saying to me? He replied, I had to do it. I had to do it for the money. At that moment I realized I was hearing the confession of a killer. I told him he shouldn't be telling me this, that he must call the police. He went on, I have cancer, so I'm going to die anyway. My wife wants to go back to Vietnam to start a business. The money is for her. It was a contract killing. Marsh tried to convince me. I cut the conversation short. I felt completely uncomfortable and quite scared by what I'd been told, and I called the police. That night I received 2 more calls from Marsh urging me to meet him. I agreed and went to his home briefly the next morning with a photographer. What I wasn't aware of at the time was police were already interviewing Marsh's wife and brother-in-law. Their evidence plus Marsh's phone call to me was enough to arrest and charge him with murder for years after he was convicted. Walter Marsh launched an appeal against his sentence. The aim was to get the term reduced to a minimum of 24 years. His lawyers argued that certain evidence surrounding his training with using knives whilst in the Marine Corps should not have been admitted in the trial. There are no striking similarities between the method Marsh was allegedly taught to inflict and the wounds inflicted upon the deceased. It was also argued that the sentence of life was manifestly excessive. They said there had been no torture prior to the murder, no sexual motive, no more than one victim, and Walter had a clean criminal record. Justice Harrison said that the murder demonstrated a high level of planning and was clearly a sustained and merciless attack upon an innocent and defenseless victim. These matters combined to raise the awful specter of future dangerousness to the community. He said for those reasons the appeal was rejected and the original sentence stood. Speaking outside court, David said he was relieved by the outcome. April 2020, 59-year-old Walter Marsh was found dead in his cell at Lithgow Correctional Center. He was found at 8:20 a.m. and no cause of death was immediately given, but it was later reported he had taken his own life. Michelle Beat's funeral had been attended by more than 1,000 people. It was clear just how much of an impact she had had in her community following her death. The Michelle Beats Award for Inspirational Pediatric Care was founded. It aims to recognize the achievement of individuals who go above and beyond to advance children's health in New South Wales, adding though her life was tragically cut short, Michelle's legacy continues to live on. Her legacy lives on not just in the award but in the lives she touched throughout her many years in healthcare. Every patient she cared for, every colleague she supported and helped, every act of kindness and selflessness she displayed, they are echoes of a life spent in service to others. And while justice was done and may bring some degree of peace, it is her compassion, her dedication and her humanity that continue to endure as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Cared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.